I'm going to move on now because I want to save time for our speech, our featured speaker. If I can bring up Dr. Fulgham, would you like to come to the stage?
Ready.
Colonel Dan Fulgham was in the Air Force for 32 years. He's going to talk to us tonight a little bit about his experience with the space program. But for those of you who maybe haven't been to some of his previous lectures, he's had quite a charmed life, if you will. He was an eyewitness to the Texas City disaster, helped carry bodies away from that disaster back in the 40s. He was able to fly in Korea as a fighter pilot, in Vietnam as a fighter pilot, a high-altitude parachutist, a master balloonist, and so quite a varied background. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about the space program, but I encourage you when he's finished to ask him some questions about some of his other life experiences if you'd like. I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'm going to concentrate pretty much on manned space business in the U.S. And what I intend to do is to lead you through some of the original research that developed some advanced aircraft and eventually led to spacecraft development. And then we'll end up on the conclusion of all the manned space flight in the United States. This is a picture of the X-1 vehicle, Bell aircraft, and Chuck Yeager's flying that, and he's setting out to break, of all things, Mach 1. That's 700 miles an hour and maybe a few more, depending on the altitude and the temperature. The night before, and we'll do something personal, the night before Chuck made this flight, he was out at a local off-base bar and corral with some horses and everything. It was run by Pancho Barnes, which was she was quite a figure in the Mojave Desert. And the name of the bar was the Happy Bottom Riding Club, if that gives you any clues about what's going on. But Chuck got on a horse and was thrown off and broke a rib. He didn't tell anybody, wrapped some tape around it, and went out the next day and flew the airplane to Mach 1. What he didn't know at the time, or he might have, was there's another test pilot from North American Aviation named George Welch, and he was testing the XP-86, which became eventually the fighter in the Korean War that had about a 10-to-1 kill ratio over the MiG-15. And Chuck and, or George rather, in testing this aircraft would go to full power, point it straight down, and he could just break through Mach 1. And he did this about 2 weeks before Chuck flew his flight. And then just to push it to Chuck's face, he did it again about 30 minutes before Chuck's flight. And, but he was not able to claim it because he wasn't instrumented the way the X-1 was. So we'll talk about some of that aspects of it a little bit later on. This was my association that I'll be covering just about all of these points sometime during the presentation. But our laboratory at Wright-Patterson was really involved in aircrew protection. And we had been doing that since back in the B-17 days and the B-24s, how to protect people at high altitudes where you can get hypoxia and pass out without even knowing it. And I was part of the Mercury astronaut selection team. We'll talk about that. And then I was a test parachutist in the Gemini escape system and did personal equipment officer for the Manned Orbital Laboratory. All of these occurred in just 2 decades. And then I became the sole test parachutist for the X-20 escape system and became the officer in charge of the pararescue team for the X-15. We had a super secret program going at Wright-Patterson called MISS, Man in Space Soonest. We knew the Russians were working to put a vehicle into orbit, and we were going to beat them at that and see if we couldn't get ahead of the Russians for a change. We had two contractors under contract to build the prototypes for this vehicle, and one was McDonnell Aircraft Corporation in St. Louis, and this was the vehicle that they had designed. The other one was General Electric, and I don't have any pictures of that because we never completed that program. We went out and made the inspection of this mock-up at McDonnell, Dick Willis and myself and Ed Vail, and we turned McDonnell down because it was made out of cardboard and pasted instruments in there, and the General Electric vehicle looked like it could have gone to flight. So what we were doing, we were also checking how do we protect pilots in space. We had no space experience, absolutely none. The highest an airplane could fly in those days was about 35,000 feet. And the commercial airplanes didn't begin pressurized until the late 50s. And I'll never forget, I was up flying with a student, and I was at 20,000 feet out over West Texas, and here comes a commercial airliners, American Airlines flying at 21,000. I said, oh hell, there goes our playground right there. So we had all of these tests that we went through to pick the most viable candidates, and I was part of the experimental subject in a lot of these. And the one I hated the worst was the one called the cold pressor test, and it was developed by a doctor in 1920. 1920 he did this. It consists of putting your feet into ice cold crushed ice water, and you sat there and kept your feet in that crushed ice, and the pain would start working up your ankles, and your leg bone and body hit your knees. And the termination point of this test was when you couldn't stand the pain any longer, you said, okay, I quit. And a flight surgeon sat there measuring your blood pressure and your heart rate all of this time. And I did it as long as I could, and when I quit, and the guy turned me loose, the flight surgeon, he said, Danny, you better watch out because later in life you're going to develop high blood pressure. And believe it or not, that happened in about 20 years. I was almost having trouble staying on flight status because of that. We also had to do high altitude examinations. We built this capsule that's big enough to hold a man standing up. We put Joe Kittinger in this vehicle. The parachutes set the records, and sent him to 80,000 feet with a balloon hauling this up. And we almost lost Joe because one of the things we could not adequately test in the laboratory was the effect of the sun on the vehicle. And Joe got so hot in there that his internal temperature, his core temperature went up to 105 degrees. And those of you know something about medicine, that's getting to the real danger point. And how did we get him up there? We used a balloon. This is a 39,000 cubic foot balloon that we could attach and just send him right on up. Oh God. I didn't know this was going to come up, but I had to deal with it. Okay, Mom, I understand. So I'm not going to dwell on this because most of you already know about the Roswell story. On a balloon training flight in Roswell in May of 1959, Bill Kaufman and I and Joe Kittinger crash landed a balloon in the outskirts of Roswell. Joe and I were injured. There's the 800-pound gondola that we flew open. Three of us, Joe Kittinger's out taking this picture of the Bill Kaufman and I. And the helmet I was wearing, when the balloon drug the gondola on the ground as we were making a landing. It turned upside down, weighed 800 pounds, trapped my head between the edge of the balloon, the gondola and the ground, crushed the helmet, crushed the blood vessels and nerves in my scalp, and of course all that free fluid that started swelling. And my head got about the size, according to Joe, of a basketball. Eyes swelled shut, turned black, and I couldn't see. If I wanted to talk to somebody, I had to hold the lids of my eyes open. And Joe was cut into the face. Well, after I got home, what they did was they said it's going to form scar tissue if we don't do something about that fluid. And the flight surgeon didn't have a needle big enough to aspirate this, so he went down to the vet shop and got a horse syringe with a needle that was about the size of your little finger and started pulling that liquid out of my head, wrapped it with an ace bandage, and sent me home. But what happened was the people at Roswell saw me in the hospital, and I didn't really look quite normal for a human being. So that was the genesis, really, of the Roswell story right there. Roswell saw an opportunity to make a little money out of that. And the Air Force did an investigation and concluded, yes and true, I am the Air Force alien. One of my friends flew out to Roswell and took pictures of what was going on out there. And this is the street light at Roswell. And one of the pictures he brought back had me on the, I don't know how I got up on that light pole. Now you satisfied, Mom? We'll go ahead. Okay, now what happened to the big program that we had going at Wright-Patterson for putting man in space? 1957, Sputnik went up. The Eisenhower administration panicked. Really, the media is the one that panicked and drove the issue of we got to do something to catch up with the Russians. Now, they've got this object up there circling the Earth, which indicates that we're really falling behind. So they formed NASA in 1958, took all of the research that we had been doing for the MISS program, the Manned Space Studies program, turned it over to NASA, and it became the Mercury program. And the mission statement was identical with what we used word for word on the MISS program. And then they selected the astronauts, and on 1 April of '59, they announced the Mercury 7. Here's what went into that selection. We thought, well, we'll put people out on just volunteers. And we came back and figured, okay, that'll be about 3,000 people. We can't handle that. So they kept whittling down the requirements to be eligible for the program. And you can see what those are. You had to be a current or former test pilot, possess an engineering degree, 41 years or younger, and be under 5'11" in height. That got us down to about 135 candidates. And finally, they were all tested at Lovelace Clinic in New Mexico, and we wound up at Wright-Patterson with 35 candidates to be tested there. And out of that 35, we set the names of 15 of those people that we thought were the most eligible to be Mercury astronauts. And those 15 names went to NASA in Langley at that time. And all of them fit the criteria except one. And we'll make it a guessing game right now as to which one wasn't eligible, in fact. Okay, here are the astronauts, the Mercury 7. Gus Grissom, Shepard, Carpenter, Schirra, Slayton, John Glenn, and Gordon Cooper. This picture was taken in Houston the day they made the announcement. On a personal note, Gus Grissom was at Wright-Patterson with me, and we flew together, and I knew him quite well. And I was fitting him with a pressure suit over at the laboratory before the selection. And I said, Gus, I've heard that there's some friction between you and Gordon Cooper. He said, yeah, if Gordon gets selected and I'm selected, I'm quitting the program. I won't fly with that SOB. Well, what it really turned out to be, they were in the same flight test school at the Edwards for experimental test pilots. And during the program, Gus and Cooper took a T-33 and flew cross country, I think to Indiana to visit his people. And the protocol was that when you're flying a tandem aircraft like this, the guy in the front seat is the aircraft commander. The guy in the back is supposed to sit there and keep his hands off the controls and be quiet. So when they landed at Luke to refuel on the way back to Edwards, Gordon took the back seat, Gus moved up to the front seat, they refueled and taxied out for takeoff, started down the runway at Luke. It was pretty hot, and it took a long time before they could get into the air. And Gordon decided, hell, they ought to be airborne by now, so he reached down and pulled the gear up, and the airplane wasn't quite at at takeoff speed, and he settled back into the runway and went off the end of the runway with sparks and parts flying all over the place. And you can imagine here are two guys that are test pilots, or about to be test pilots, and pull a dumb stunt like that. So they didn't get along well at all. Gus was a superb engineer. Gordon Knight's not quite so good. John Glenn, when Glenn went through the selection program, we at Wright-Patterson had a bet pool as to who would be the first guy to go into orbit. And it turned out to be John Glenn. He was an all-American boy, blonde, blue-eyed, personable to a fault. I've seen John go into a party where he didn't know anybody there, nobody had ever seen him before, and within 15 minutes he was people were dragging their friends over to say, come on, I want you to meet my best friend, John Glenn. And that's just the kind of guy he was. There they are, all suited out. These suits were made really for the X-15 program, and they were produced by David Clark Company in Worcester, Massachusetts. And how did we wind up with that particular suit? We started building them at Wright-Pat. We had a lot of cloth experience, but absolutely no experience working with rubber fabrics. So we started looking for a contractor who had some experience in fabrics, rubberized, and came up with David Clark Company. And their business was building bras and girdles for Sears Roebuck. And that's how they were selected to build pressure suits. They went on to build not only the Mercury suits, but they built the Gemini suits and in the beginning of the Apollo suits that finally went to the moon. The capsule that NASA selected, it looks just like the capsule that was at McDonnell. The story behind this is that the lead guy back at NASA Langley was a guy named Warren North. And he was pretty much running the whole astronaut selection program. And he decided that that was the capsule they ought to use. Warren North. The test pilot, chief test pilot at McDonnell Aircraft was a guy named Burt North, who just happened to be Warren North's twin brother. So there was never a lot of discussion about how that selection came about, but it's pretty obvious. Okay, the Mercury flight schedule went like this. Shepard flew a suborbital flight and went into the ocean just south of Bermuda. The second flight was Gus Grissom, and he went into the water about the same time. And for some reason, when the capsule goes in the water, the pickup ship sends some boats out and they put an inflatable vest around the capsule to keep it from sinking when they open the door. And for some reason, Gus got in a hurry, opened the door before they got the collar around the machine, and wound up just barely getting out in time and into the boat, and the capsule sank. And it was down there for many years. Now, I think about a decade ago, somebody finally located it and recovered it. John made the third flight, full orbit, and the last flight was Cooper, that was in 1963. And Cooper came back and said, you know, when I went over to West Texas, I looked down and I could see some trucks on the highway. And the academics immediately jumped all over him and said, you're just running your ego wild again, because from 100 miles up, those trucks would be too small. You couldn't see them because of the visual arc necessary to view something. And by God, Cooper was right. When they got to the Gemini program, they put some targets on the ground on the highway out in West Texas, and they could see them. So he regained some credibility. Deke Slayton didn't fly because he wound up with a rhythmic heart. He would beat just steady as it could be, and then every now and then he would start skipping a beat. And then he'd go back normal, and for 4 or 5 beats, then he would skip a beat. And I think a lot of people have that, and I have it, as a matter of fact. And so they wouldn't let him fly until much, much later in the Gemini program when they had 2 people on board. Actually, the first 2 people were the chimps, Ham and Enos. We flew Ham on a mission in orbit. And when we got ready to repeat that, because we were at least 2 animal tests, we started to put Ham back in, and Ham says, not me. He had both feet and both arms around that door, and so we had to go get Enos to complete that mission flight. Here's the current status of all of the Mercury astronauts. They're all gone now except John Glenn, and John just had a heart valve replacement a couple of months ago and seems to be doing all right now. I was labeled the 8th astronaut because NBC News, the Huntley Brinkley show on the Sundays, called over to NASA and wanted to get some of the astronauts to go through the selection program again so he could film it and educate the public. NASA said no. So the Huntley Brinkley people came to Wright-Patterson, and I just happened to be available. They put me through the entire selection program again, filming it all, and it was Chet Huntley that labeled me as the 8th astronaut because of that involvement. Okay, let's jump over to the X-15 program. Here's a B-52 aircraft. You can see the X-15 under the right wing on a pylon, and they would jack the airplane up and connect it to the B-52. And this is Scott Crossfield flying this one. Fitzhugh Fulton's flying the B-52. They would take off and fly up to Nellis, turn around and aim back toward the flight test center. 35,000 feet, they would drop the airplane, the rocket engine would start, and they would take off. And the reason they went up to Nellis and came back this way, because there's a whole string of dry lake beds, and they're smoother than this stage. And if they had an engine failure or a problem, they could go down and land. Let's see, 3 Silver Lakes, 3 Sisters Lakes, Cudahy Lakes, Muroc, and then Rosamond Lake. So they had a lot of landing areas to go. The B-52 is a remarkable airplane. As a matter of fact, I flew in one for a while. See those wing tips? When they got in any kind of turbulence, the wings would, flap, sort of. The wing tips had a 22-foot excursion. if you can imagine metal bending that much in flight, it was awesome for people that flew stiff-wing fighters to see something like that going on. Here is the X-15 during one of its acceptance flights. They set all kinds of records that still stand for manned vehicles. 4,520 miles per hour was the speed record set by Pete Knight. The altitude that all of the astronauts, not astronauts, but test pilots that flew, all of them exceeded 50 miles, and that became then the standard for astronaut wings. If you flew anything, got above 50, you qualified for an astronaut wing. Most successful airplane ever built, 199 flights, and I was the medical monitor on 90 of those flights at Flight Test Center at Edwards. Here's Scott Crossfield landing on a lake, one of the lake beds. I think this is on Rosamond. And you see the ventral fin, or the ventral fin here is shorter than the top. Well, it wasn't when they took off, but in order to land on these wire brush skids, they would have to jettison that fin. Otherwise, it would hit the runway when you got down. And Scott, in this particular case, had the nose up when he touched down to kill off airspeed, and it's got regular wheels in the front. And when he dropped the nose, it broke the airplane in half, about where you see the S on the U.S. In North America, they had to come back and repair that particular vehicle before we could accept it. And Ken Griffin, let's see, Ken, oh, there he is up there. Dr. Griffin knew one of the astronauts named Mike Adams and asked me about him. Yes, I knew Mike. He and I were in the Manned Orbital Laboratory program together, and when it looked like that program was going to go into the wastebasket, Mike was offered to come back up to Edwards and check out in the X-15 because we were getting some spaces available. So he came back, and in his first flight in the X-15, he launched from the B-52, got up to altitude. I think he made about 2,000 miles an hour. And when he got ready the rocket engine burned out, he made a bad mistake. He started a turn in the vehicle before he was low enough in airspeed, and wound up, the airplane departed flight, started tumbling, and I think they figured that the G-forces on his body in the cockpit was about 60 G, 60 times the gravity. And we believe he was dead before the airplane broke up and fell apart. And that was getting pretty close to finishing the X-15 program. We had ordered 3, lost the one from Mike. The third one was never delivered, and Scott Crossfield turned it over to the Air Force. And we offered Scott Crossfield an opportunity to fly in the Gemini program, and we had to fully instrument these people for heart rate and blood pressure, and we wanted core temperature, which you can only get with a rectal probe. And Crossfield said, "Go to hell." So nobody's going to stick a wire up my butt. So he was one of the old-time test pilots. Here are the original X-15 pilots. Bob Rushworth, Jack McKay, Forrest Peterson was Navy, Jack was NASA, Russ was Air Force, Joe Walker, and then Neil Armstrong, and then Bob White was the original F-15 pilot for the Air Force, original. All of those are gone now. Walker was killed, we'll talk about that in a minute. Neil Armstrong died a year ago. Yeah, I think it was last year. And that was the end of those guys. Russ went on to make Major General and died of a heart attack. Bob White made Major General and died of a heart attack. Joe was killed, and I don't know about Peterson and McKay. I think both of them are gone now as well. Chuck Yeager again. This is the NF-104. 4 of them belong to the Flight Test Center. It's a standard Air Force F-104 with a rocket engine installed. And what they wanted was the astronaut trainees to get experience flying up to 90,000 feet. They could get the airplane going as fast as they could, pull it up, and just as they got the right attitude, they would fire the rocket engine and go roaring up. Chuck never made it quite to 80,000 feet. What he did was lose control of the airplane, because when you get up to those altitudes, you don't have enough air to use the aerodynamic controls at all. The elevators and the wings just don't work. So they put the little rocket motors in the tips of each wing and in the nose, so that they could rotate the airplane with firing these little rockets or keep its attitude this way. Chuck lost all of that. He got into such a flat spin he couldn't recover, and he punched out in the ejection seat. And if you've seen the movie The Right Stuff, the guy that opens the scene, and here comes a pilot walking across the desert and up into view, that was Sam Shepard playing the part of Chuck Yeager. But what in truth happened, when Yeager bailed out, he claimed that the oxygen bar in the face mask of his pressure suit exploded and blew a piece of the faceplate off and seared his face pretty badly. He was pretty well scarred up there to begin with. And he said it was the oxygen bar in the suit. I knew that couldn't be possible, because I had worked on these suits for a long time, and there was no way an oxygen bar could explode. So I got Chuck's equipment, laid out his parachute on the floor, and started reefing it back the way it would have come out of the pack when he pulled the ripcord. And sure enough, as the suspension lines got together, here were some black marks. About every 2 feet, there was a black mark on the about that wide across the suspension lines. And I could scrape it and it would come off. I smell it, it smelled like burned rocket fuel. And I knew then what happened. When you leave an ejection seat, it's got about the same body frontal area as the human body, and the seat tends to hang around you. And so what really happened was, after he ejected and left the seat, the end of the rocket, which was it was a rocket fuel that left a black residue, and it hit him in the face, the end of the rocket, with all that flame and fire, and broke his faceplate. And I went back to Chuck and told him, I said, look, I know what your story is, but this doesn't look good. And Chuck looked at me and said, now listen, Fulgham, I gave my story and it's going to stand, so just forget it. We're not about to go change the official record. So I dropped it, although we sent the residue up to the rocket lab, and they came back and verified it was indeed from the ejection seat. Chuck never, let's go back here. Chuck was never a candidate for the astronaut programs either. He had a high school education and no engineering training at all. This is the XB-70, North American Aviation. It is a 6-engine Mach 3 airplanes. I've flown chase on that a couple of times, and the airplane is the most beautiful thing in the air you've ever seen in your life, all white, sleek. He would go up on a test flight, and he would fly, 30 minutes at Mach 1, 700 miles an hour. Then he would goose it up to Mach 2 for 30 minutes, and he would goose it up to Mach 3 for about 20 minutes. Of course, nobody could stay with him at that kind of speeds. And during that test period, let's see, this is Al White flying the airplane here, one of the test pilots from North American. GE started lobbying the Air Force to get all of the airplanes with GE engines together at one time in formation so they could take a photo op of that formation. And all of these airplanes had GE engines. Up here at the top is a T-38, then the F-4 that I flew in Vietnam, then the XB-70 with Al White flying, and a friend of mine named Carl Cross was an Air Force pilot that was just checking out of the XB-70. It's his first flight. And on the other side, the airplane with the red tail, that's Joe Walker flying in formation for this photo op. And down here is an F-5 that we borrowed from the Marines down at Miramar. And Joe Cotton, who was the X-50 or the XB-70 program manager, called out and said, "Joe, you're a little bit behind." Said, "How about moving forward a little bit so that you're about the same relation over here, and we can get everybody in a nice tight picture?" So Joe started moving forward. And remember, the F-104 has a very high T-tail. The horizontal stabilizer is way up on top. Joe moved forward, and the official accident report said that he got caught in turbulence at the wingtip, and it pitched the airplane up and broke off the left vertical fin. The F-104 blew up on top of the XB-70 and took out the other vertical fin. And I'm pretty sure, because I've flown close to this airplane with the wingtips down, that what really happened was Joe didn't fly the F-4 very often. He slid forward and contacted that wingtip, which was down, with the top of that horizontal stabilizer. And when he hit that, it pitched him up and over and broke it off. But they never changed an accident report. So what happened was Al White flying the airplane says, it's so big. And Al White said, "What happened?" Said, "I felt a little tremor, but I don't see anything up here that says anything's wrong." And Joe Cotton says, "I think you better plan on a flat spin, Al, because you lost both your vertical fins." And sure enough, the airplane started rotating and finally fell off and couldn't be recovered. I've got that whole sequence on film. And finally, Joe Cotton said, "You guys get out. Al, punch out, both of you." And Al said, "Okay, it's about time." He pulled the levers, and the capsule folded, and he went out. Carl Cross never got out. And we surmised that what happened was when the rocket motor to boost Al's seat out, which is a pretty closed, or pretty heavy closed capsule, the fireball that was created inside the cockpit incapacitated Carl Cross, and he never got out of the airplane. So the result of the XB-70, that's it on the floor of the Mojave Desert. What a waste. We only had 2 of those, so the other one is now resting at the museum at Wright-Patterson in the Air Force Museum. Kennedy made his famous speech about, we want to put a man on the moon within this decade. When they said that, all we had was just finish up the Berkeley program. We knew that we were going to have some extravehicular activity, so we designed the Gemini aircraft, and it was a 2-man vehicle, and the escape systems all had to be tested, and the tests weren't going well down El Centro. The NASA called the Air Force and asked to borrow me to come back and be the senior jumper on that program, which I accepted and went to El Centro for that program. This is a picture of the Gemini system, and the two pilots or two astronauts in it. And if they had a problem or an accident as high as 77,000 feet, I don't know how they came up with that, they could eject from the vehicle on just a standard aircraft ejection system. And the recovery was, since could be very high altitude, had to be tested thoroughly. And the drag chute that would slow the pilot down after he ejected from the vehicle had what we called a balloon. It was a top-shaped device that had little air cups on the side that as the air went up against the balloon, it would inflate it and keep it inflated until we got down to about 15,000 feet when the parachute would open automatically. I think that's me, Chuck Lane, taking pictures of it. And what was happening was, with that single point suspension, the guy hanging under the chute would spin, and it would get uncomfortable because they couldn't control the spin. And they made no attempt at it, they just did the old paratrooper position. And on my first jump with it, I discovered that I started to spin, and I just put my arms and legs out in a standard skydive position, stopped the spin, and we kept right on going with the program. This is landed just, I think this was about my third jump. Weber people, the interesting thing here, before we made the first jump, we did a full-up mannequin drop in which we dressed the mannequin exactly the way the pilot would be dressed and pushed him out the back of a C-130 and let all the systems operate the way they're supposed to, firing the balloon, cutting it loose, opening the parachute, et cetera. And for that first drop, astronaut Bean and astronaut Lovell flew out to El Centro to witness that drop, and so they could go back and verify that everything was working. The mannequin came out, and it fell, and it fell, and it fell, and finally it impacted the ground with absolutely nothing happened, nothing opened at all. Jim looked at Bean, Bean looked at Jim, they never said a word, they got in the staff car, drove off, got in the airplane, flew back to Houston. And so we never knew what his opinion was of that accident, but obviously it wasn't happy. Okay, let's sort of finish up with the capsule. The Apollo capsule was built by North American Aviation. And this is after all these successful flights in the Mercury and the Gemini program. Why they went to a different contractor other than maybe McDonnell was just overloaded. So the pilots that were selected for this was the first capsule that came out. And incidentally, while I was at the flight test center at Edwards, a lot of the astronauts to be went through the program there. Dr. Pat used to play kickball in the street with Frank Borman's kids. Charlie Bassett lived right down the street from us, and I don't think you knew any of those particular guys. Charlie Bassett came to me and said, "Hey, I want to be an astronaut," but I said, "Charlie, you can't do that unless you leave the Air Force and go to NASA," which he finally did. And then he and Elliot C. took a T-38 during the Gemini program and flew over to McDonnell to see what they were doing with the suit in the clean room. And when they got ready to leave, they took off and from the airport there and made a big turn and impacted the top of the building that the suit was being built. Killed both of them instantly, but we lost 2 astronauts on that program. This is the one that became Apollo 1. There's Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Young, and Chaffee. Young had flown Gemini. Of course, Gus had flown Mercury and Gemini, but Chaffee was a ab initio astronaut. first time ever. So what happened? January 27, 1967, the Apollo fire occurred, and it killed all three, which I'll go through in a minute. The Air Force had done all the research at Brooks Air Force Base on encapsulated systems with 100% oxygen. And we went back to NASA and said, don't do it, it's dangerous. You can't control it. If you do have a fire, you're going to lose some people. And we lost one in the Air Force. NASA said, we can't afford to have a mixed gas environment because that means more cylinders of nitrogen to go with the oxygen. And so besides that, we know what we're doing, so go away. Here they are in the capsule, Grissom on the right, Young in the middle, and Chatfield on the left side. About 5 hours into the first plug out means they're just going to simulate a launch right up to the point of actually firing the rocket motors and disconnecting. And 5 hours into the test, they had been having some trouble with the equipment. The communications were a problem. And all of a sudden, we think it was Chaffee said, hey, I smell smoke. And of course, they're under pressure, 100% oxygen environment. And just a few seconds later, Young says, hey, we got a fire in here. Get us out of here as quick as you can. And they actually started to try and take the hatch off, but with the pressure, the hatch design was to open to the inside. So with all that pressure inside, there was no way in the world they were going to be able to pull that hatch open. Well, in 90 seconds, the heat had become so high inside that capsule, it actually ruptured the capsule, and smoke and flames came shooting out into the clean room, and we knew we had a real problem. I wasn't down there, but I went through all of this reports. There's what the inside of the capsule looked like after the fire. And I don't think there was enough left of any of the three of them to even do an autopsy, to tell you the truth. I never saw one out of that. Well, that resulted in a year's delay in the Apollo program while they redesigned the capsule, went to a mixed oxygen-nitrogen environment, and retrained the people. So I won't go through all of the Apollos, but I knew most all of them. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins flew the first moon landing, and everybody's seen that and knows what happened. I want to talk about Jim Irwin just a minute, because he lived at Edwards the same time we were there as well. And Apollo 17 was the last system on the moon, and that ended the Apollo program. Jim Irwin, he was a young experimental test pilot at Edwards. During his off-duty hours, he belonged to the Aero Club, which flew light airplanes, and he was instructor pilot, teaching young people to fly, young airmen mostly. And on one of the flights, the airman he was instructing froze on the controls as they were making a landing, crashed the airplane, broke Jim's legs in about 3 different places. And if it hadn't been for one of the flight surgeons interceding, they were going to amputate that leg, which would have ended that entirely right there. So Jim was in the same organization I was in, and he used to come down in his therapy on crutches, walking down the hall in just in obviously high agony, and finally worked to the point where he was just using hand canes, and then he finally was able to walk pretty normally. And I had told him, I worked with him some, I said, Jim, if you'll work hard and get those legs in shape, I will take you skiing up at Wrightwood in the Angeles Mountains. And he did. And when he said, I'm ready to go, I drove him up, we put him on skis and put him down the hill. And the flight surgeon, when he found out about it, offered to kill both of us because he was afraid we were going to hit his thing. The thing that happened to Jim and Dave Scott, when they got on the surface of the moon, they had this vehicle that they drove around, electric vehicle. And it's sort of like one of these four-wheelers that you see now. And before he left the surface of the moon, he cut a piece of fabric off of one of the previous vehicles, equipment that had been left there, and took it with him back to the Earth. And when he got back, he put it up for auction and it got $315,000 for that patch. And he was going to use that money to start a charity for the Apollo children, all the children of the Apollo astronauts. But he also took, and so did Dave Scott, a batch of first order stamps and postcards to the moon and back, and sold them to a German dealer. NASA had been doing this quite a while. A lot of the astronauts did the same thing, and NASA just looked the other way, didn't bother. But for some reason, they decided to make an example of Dave and or Jim and Dave Scott. Jim quit the Air Force, went to Colorado Springs, and became a religious preacher. And he died about 2 decades ago now at about age 61. During the time he was at Edwards, I was president of the Edwards Theater Club, Stage Club, and we had a play going on in which I was the lead, and Jim's wife, Mary, was the female lead, and part of the thing was that at the end of the play, we realized that we were attracted to each other, and we kissed. And we faked it all during the early practice rounds, but Jim found out about it and came to the real play, and we had agreed ahead of time that when the last play, we would actually kiss. And it just made Jim absolutely furious, and we had a real problem with him for quite a while. Okay, we know what happened here. This is getting real near the end of everything. The MISS program was given to NASA. The X-20 program was given the go-ahead to complete, and the Manned Orbital Laboratory. So we had those two in the Air Force. NASA was going to give us 2 Gemini vehicles to use for training, which they never did. Then McNamara canceled the X-20 program. He also canceled the MAL program, all in the name of saving money for the military. This was the X-20. That's an artist's conception. It was an orbital glider that could be put into orbit, in a polar orbit, and as long as we wanted to keep it, then he could come in, and to choose his landing places, he could skip off the top of the atmosphere and go back out. And he kept doing that. That's why they call it the dinosaur, the dynamic soaring vehicle. And McNamara canceled that one. Boeing was already bidding metal for that airplane. We selected the air crews. The spacesuit jump tests were near completion, and the first flight was scheduled for 1968. I was the sole experimental parachute test subject on the X-20 program, and I was up on my 10th jump, standing on the back end of the airplane, C-130, ready to go. This is the configuration. My basic weight was 150, and standing on the back of the airplane, I weighed 300. So the equipment contributed a lot. And the pilot came back while I was standing there and unplugged me from the communication systems and plugged in and said, Danny, McNamara just canceled the X-20 program. Do you want to go ahead and make this jump? I said, not unless you guarantee that you can safely land this airplane. I said, just unsuit me and let's get back on the ground, which we did. The X-20 program evolved into, guess what, Space Shuttle. Didn't quite look like that when NASA got it done. So that really ended the manned space program for the United States. The Air Force had it in 52 to 68. The NASA manned space program started out with Mercury and ended with a space shuttle on the 11th of September. The future of the International Space Station is still up in the air, and so the U.S. is hostage to Russia and China. As you well know, all of the rocket engines now used in the United States were built by the Russians and are still being built by the Russians. The Russians charge us almost $2 million per man to go to the International Space Station. And I don't know how long we're going to put up with that either. We're trying to do it unmanned, which they should have done to begin with. At one time, the space shuttle program was consuming 88% of the NASA budget, just that shuttle alone. Okay, I'm going to quit there and entertain questions if you have any.
Good. Any questions?
What impact or what kind of impact would the blow up of the orbital science craft recently have on our space program?
Say it one more time, please.
What kind of impact will the blow up of the orbital science craft have on our program and research?
The crash that just occurred in Virginia, the Russian rocket that exploded on takeoff, he's asking what kind of impact that'll have on going up to the space station.
That was Orbital Science's vehicle. It had 2 Russian engines on it. They had been refurbished in China, I think, and then sold to the United States. And they're just now investigating the speculation that it was an engine that blew up. They don't know that for sure yet. It'll set the program back for Orbital Sciences about a year. And in the meantime, SpaceX is the other competitor that's sending, not people, but sending cargo to the space station. And it may be if they delay the Orbital Sciences more than a year, SpaceX will probably pick up that load, more likely than not.
So it's interesting, they said that they had about 5 months of supplies left on the space station at the time this happened. If it really were to take a year for that program to come around, I suppose we'd be resupplied by
SpaceX and the Russians.
Or the Russians.
We're really a captive of the Russians in the manned space program, which we don't have anymore.
Other questions? Do you think we should have a manned space program to Mars, or do you think we can support the kind of cost it's going to take?
Well, if the human beings lose their desire to always go out into the unknown and find what's going on, yes, we will have to have a space program, a manned program. But more and more is turning to automated unmanned systems.